Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teen Talk Politics Made Simple, where we unpack the complex world of American politics. I'm your host, Mallory Hinck, and in today's episode, we're going to break down the history of election in the U.S., take a look at how the Republican National Convention, RNC, and the Democratic National Convention, DNC, function, dive into the American campaigning process, discuss one of the most controversial aspects of American politics, campaign finance, and talk about the importance of presidential primaries. It's going to be a packed episode, so let's get right into it. To truly understand how American elections work today, we need to take a brief journey through history. The U.S. presidential election system has gone through numerous changes since the country's founding in 1789. Originally, the Electoral College was set up as a way for the states to have a say in the election process of the president. But with the restrictions on who could vote, the process was far from democratic. In the beginning, only white male property owners could vote. It wasn't until the 15th Amendment in 1870, which granted voting rights regardless of race, and the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted voting rights to women, that votes truly expanded in the U.S. But even then, many barriers to voting still existed for marginalized groups, such as voter literacy tests and poll taxes, which were often used to suppress the votes of African Americans and other minorities. The modern system of elections began to take shape in the 20th century, particularly with the introduction of primaries. Before primaries were widespread, political parties would choose their candidates in smoke-filled rooms at party conventions. However, as voter engagement grew, primaries became the main method for selecting candidates. The most significant change came in the 1960s, when the Democratic Party adopted primary systems that gave voters a direct say in the selection of nominees, reducing the power of the party elites. Today, almost every state holds primary elections or caucuses, where voters directly influence the candidates. The general election process remains largely the same. Every 4 years, Americans vote for the president, and their vote is counted in the Electoral College, which ultimately decides the winner. The system has faced criticism, particularly in close elections, but it's a key feature to how elections work in America. Now, let's dive into one of the most fascinating and sometimes chaotic elements of American politics, the Republican National Convention, or RNC. The RNC is where the Republican Party formally nominates its candidate for president, finalizes the party platform, and unites to rally behind the nominee for the upcoming election. How does it work? The RNC typically takes place in the summer of an election year, just a few months before the general election. But it's not just a big party or a national pep rally, it's a deeply strategic event. Here's how it works. 1. Primary and caucuses. Before the convention, Republican voters across the country cast their ballots in primaries or caucuses. These elections determine how many delegates each candidate gets. Delegates are people who represent their state or district and are tasked with voting for a candidate at the convention. Delegates and nominations. The number of delegates a candidate needs to win the nomination depends on the total number of delegates in the race. In modern times, delegates are usually pledged to vote for a specific candidate based on primary results. The convention itself is where these delegates cast their votes for the nominee, and the nominee is formally selected. However, if no candidate wins a majority of delegates going into the convention, it could lead to a contested or brokered convention, where delegates may be free to vote for whomever they choose. The RNC also plays a crucial role in setting the party platform. This platform is a formal document that outlines the party's position on key issues. While it's often a symbolic document, it does reflect the party's priorities going into the election. For example, the platform might include stances on healthcare, tax policy, and foreign relations. The convention, especially in recent years, is also a huge media spectacle. It's broadcast to millions of Americans with speeches, debates, and endorsements from party leaders. The goal? To rally the base, unify the party, and convince undecided voters back to the Republican ticket in the general election. Much like the RNC, the Democratic National Convention, or DNC, is where the Democratic Party officially nominates its candidate for president. The DNC, though structurally similar to the RNC, has its own distinct dynamics and traditions. The process begins in much the same way as the RNC, with state primaries and caucuses determining how many delegates each candidate receives. The big difference in the Democratic process, though, is the presence of superdelegates. These are party officials, such as governors, senators, and former presidents, who are free to vote for whichever candidate they choose at the convention, regardless of how their state voted. While superdelegates make a portion of the total delegates, their influence can be significant in close races. 1. Primaries and caucuses. Just like the RNC, candidates compete in a series of state elections to secure delegates. Each state has a set number of delegates that are awarded based on the result of the primaries. The Democratic Party uses a proportional system, meaning delegates are awarded in proportion to the number of votes a candidate gets in a state, rather than a winner-takes-all basis like the Republicans. Delegates and the nomination. Once all the delegates are tallied in the convention, the nominee is selected based on who has the majority. If no candidate secures a majority going into the convention, the delegates may be given more flexibility to choose a nominee in what could become a contested convention. The DNC, like the RNC, serves as an opportunity for the party to showcase its policy priorities, including the presidential candidate, and unite the party for the general election. It also provides a platform for rising stars within the party to give speeches and shape the direction of the party. We often hear from more prominent leaders such as former presidents, senators, and activists, and the DNC is seen as a crucial moment for energizing the Democratic base, particularly the more progressive elements of the party. So now we know how the conventions work, but how do the candidates actually campaign? The campaigning process in America is long, expensive, and often grueling. In the modern era, campaigns begin long before the official start of the election season, sometimes even years before the election itself. The campaigning process is typically broken down into phases. Phase 1. Pre-campaigning. In this phase, potential candidates test the waters, meet with donors, and decide whether or not to run. They start building networks of supporters, gauging public interest, and laying down the groundwork for future fundraising. Phase 2. The primary season. This is where candidates begin to engage voters in primary elections and caucuses. The goal during this period is to secure as many delegates as possible and to start shaping the party's national narrative. Candidates hold rallies, participate in debates, and start airing television and radio ads. Phase 3. The general election campaign. After securing the nomination, candidates pivot to a more national focus, appealing to independent voters and voters from other parties. The general election campaign is marked by more extensive advertising, speeches, and national worldwide tours. Candidates also engage in debates and face intense media scrutiny. A key component of campaigning is media strategy. Candidates have to craft their image, control their narrative, and use social media platforms to reach voters directly. TV ads, social media campaigns, and town halls all play a role in how candidates connect with the electorate. And now, we get into the heart of one of the most controversial aspects of American politics, campaign finance. The issue of money in politics has become one of the most pressing and outrageous issues in the recent years. In 2010, the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United versus FEC fundamentally altered the campaign finance landscape. The court ruled that corporations and unions could spend unlimited amounts of money on independent political campaigns. While this was hailed a victory for free speech, critics argue that it essentially legalized corruption by allowing wealthy donors and corporations to have disproportionate influence over elections. Since then, super PACs, political action committees, have proliferated. These organizations can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money on behalf of candidates, often through dark money, which is money spent by anonymous donors. The sheer scale of spending in the U.S. elections is staggering. In the 2020 presidential election, more than $14 billion were spent, making it the most expensive election in the U.S. history. The influence of money on elections is undeniable. Now, it's time we explore the fascinating world of primary elections. How did they start? Why do we have them? What is the importance of the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucus? Buckle up as we unpack the history, the significance, and the impact of primary elections in the U.S. Let's begin with the basics. What are primary elections and why do we have them? In the United States, primary elections are a crucial part of the process for selecting presidential candidates. They serve as a means for voters to express their preference for one of the potential nominees with a political party, ultimately determining who will represent the party in the general election. Now, to understand why we have primaries, we need to look at how the political parties used to collect their candidates. Before the 20th century, political parties selected their nominees at national conventions, but this process was often controlled by a small group of political elites. The decision was largely made in backroom deals, with little or no input from the average voter. The idea of primaries, where ordinary voters could directly participate in the candidate selection process, emerged as a part of a broader push for more democracy and political reform in the early 20th century. The move for primary elections gained momentum after the Progressive Era, when reformers sought to curtail the power of political machines and make the political process more transparent and participatory. The first state to hold a primary election was Wisconsin in 1905, and by the 1920s, many other states had followed in suit. These early primaries, however, were often non-binding, meaning that the votes didn't automatically dictate who would receive the party nomination. Still, they allowed voters to express their preferences and help shape the conversation around the candidates. So now that we know a bit about the history, let's talk about why primary elections matter. Primaries are incredibly important for several reasons. 1. Voter empowerment. Primaries allow voters to have a direct say in the selection of a party's nominee. This is crucial for maintaining democratic legitimacy. Without primaries, we would revert to the old system where party elites made the decision behind closed doors. 2. Testing candidates. Primaries give candidates an opportunity to test their message, appeal, and electoral viability. It's a way to see how candidates perform under pressure and whether they can gain traction among a diverse electorate. 3. Building momentum. Winning primaries can build a candidate's momentum, not just in terms of delegate counts, but also in terms of media attention, fundraising, and public support. A primary win can provide candidates with the credibility and resources they need to compete on the national stage. 4. Party unity. Although primaries can sometimes cause division within a party, they also help ensure that the eventual nominee has been vetted and has the support of a broad enough segment of the party. It forces candidates to compete and engage with a party base, which can help solidify unity heading into the general election. 5. Preventing dominance of one faction. Primaries help prevent any one faction within a political party from dominating the nomination process. Without primaries, it would be easier for one small group of party insiders or interest groups to impose a candidate on the entire party, regardless of a broader public opinion. Moving on, let's take a closer look at the New Hampshire primary, often called the first primary in the presidential election cycle. The New Hampshire primary has an outsized role in American politics and is a key part of the nomination process. The New Hampshire primary is held in early February of a presidential election year, and its status as the first primary in the nation gives it tremendous media attention and symbolic importance. But how did New Hampshire come to be the first state to hold its primary? The origins of the New Hampshire primary date back to 1916, when New Hampshire became the first state to hold a presidential primary. New Hampshire's position at the start of the calendar became solidified in 1952, when it successfully pushed to maintain its early primary date to attract more attention to its state and give it a unique influence over the election process. Over the years, New Hampshire has grown in importance. The primary is highly competitive, and candidates focus on a significant portion of their efforts there, hoping to capture momentum heading into later contests. Winning or performing strongly in New Hampshire can help propel a campaign, while a poor showing can spell the end of a candidate's prospects. But why does New Hampshire hold so much power? Well, part of it is that the state has a small, retail politics-friendly environment. Unlike larger states with massive media markets, New Hampshire's relatively small size allowed candidates to meet face-to-face with voters at town halls, local events, and intimate gatherings. This is why New Hampshire voters get so much attention from presidential hopefuls. Another reason for New Hampshire's influence is that it's a bellwether state, often considering a microcosm of the broader American electorate. If a candidate can win or do well in New Hampshire, it signals to the media and public that they might have a broad appeal necessary to compete nationally. The New Hampshire primary doesn't always predict the eventual winner, but its psychological impact and media coverage can set the tone for the entire election cycle. Next up, let's discuss the Iowa caucus, which plays a critical role in presidential nomination process. Like New Hampshire, Iowa holds outsized influence in the race, but in a very different way. Instead of a primary election, Iowa hosts a caucus, a more community-centered form of voting. The Iowa caucus typically takes place in February, and like New Hampshire, it's the first contest in the election season. But unlike the secret ballots in New Hampshire, Iowa voters participate in public grassroots process where they gather in meeting spaces across the state, often in schools, churches, or libraries, and vote by raising their hands or physically aligning themselves with their preferred candidate. The Iowa caucus has been held since 1972, but its role as the first contest was solidified when it was moved to the beginning of the primary season. Because of its early position, the Iowa caucus has become a critical event for presidential candidates. Like New Hampshire, a win or strong showing in Iowa can generate media attention, boost fundraising, and build momentum heading into subsequent contests. But Iowa's caucus system is much more complex and time-consuming than a simple primary. Voters must attend local meetings for several hours and engage in debates, making it harder for some to participate, especially younger or working-class voters. In fact, many critics argue that Iowa's demographics, predominantly white and rural, don't fully represent the diversity of the broader electorate, leading to concerns about disproportionate influence. Despite these criticisms, Iowa is still considered a key battleground in the nomination process. A strong performance here can give candidates a crucial boost in legitimacy, while a poor result can lead to early exits from the race. In recent years, we've seen numerous examples of campaigns that went from front-runner status to struggling for relevance after a disappointing result in Iowa. What's fascinating about Iowa is the impact of momentum. Because the field is often crowded in the early process, the Iowa caucus has the power to winnow the field, forcing candidates with little support to drop out and leaving only the top-tier contenders to continue on to New Hampshire and beyond. Both the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucus are pivotal, not just for their immediate results, but for how they shape the narrative of the campaign moving forward. The media often treats these early contests as the beginning of the endgame, with national momentum and media attention being pivotal in deciding who remains in the race. But the importance of these states has come under scrutiny in recent years. Critics argue that both Iowa and New Hampshire are overrepresented, given their small populations and homogeneous demographics. As the country becomes increasingly diverse, some feel that these states no longer reflect the broader political landscape of the nation. Moreover, the winner-takes-all mentality that these contests create means that campaigns often prioritize early states, leading to a heavy focus on a small proportion of the country while ignoring the larger states with more diverse electorates. Despite criticism, however, the Iowa caucus and New Hampshire primary remain critical early tests for presidential hopefuls. Whether candidates win or lose in these states, the momentum they gain or lose can ultimately determine their result in the election. Thank you for joining me today to discuss the Democratic and Republican national conventions, campaigning in America, and the importance of New Hampshire and Iowa in the presidential race. Stay curious and keep learning.